What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Floyd Street's Finest. I am your host, Jeff Greer. Super excited to be here with you after a little bit of a break. I think everybody needed some time off after the old 4-28 campaign that was this past season. But as you can see, if you're watching this on the stream, we are joined by Mike Rutherford. Mike, thrilled to have you here. But before we get into our conversation today, I just want to mention real quick, for the offseason, you got to make sure to check out the Field of 68 Media Network. There's so much content. Just saw the other day, they're starting to get into the MTE game, which is just mind-blowing to me to think where this thing started to see where it is now. But make sure you check out the array of podcasts and shows across the network. There's so much good stuff. And we're really thrilled to be a part of it. So, Mike, it's a heavy week in Louisville. I don't know how much more Louisville it could get than you go from the Kentucky Derby and the build up to the Kentucky Derby to spending some time remembering the legend who is Denny Crum. He passed away this week. By the time this episode comes out, we will be the day of the celebration of life for Denny, which is at 7 p.m. Monday night at the Yum Center, right, Mike? I just want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah.
Yum Center. So, but Mike, I know you and I both have had interactions. We've got lots of different stories about Denny, especially for a kid growing up here who is as Louisville basketball as it gets for you. First, when the news hit, what was your reaction, I guess, when you first found out that he had passed on?
I think it was just, I mean, it's one of those things that you hate to say it like this, but you know it's coming at some point in the relatively near future when somebody reaches a certain age and it's harder to have failing health. Denny's had a couple of strokes. There had been the rumors like 4 or 5 months ago, I think it was in December, that something bad was going to happen. He was not doing well, and thankfully that ended up not being 100% true. But when you actually hear it, I mean, it's like any other experience with grief in your life. You can prepare yourself for it, but when the moment actually comes, it's still a complete gut punch. It's still one of those things where your heart drops a little bit, and you react to it the best you can. It's a sad, very sad moment for everybody involved with Louisville basketball, everybody who followed Louisville basketball, certainly people who knew and loved Denny. It doesn't make it any easier to know that it was imminent. It was
Mm-hmm.
definitely one of those things where Crum became a figure in my life, especially since he was still omnipresent with Louisville basketball after his retirement, where it got to the point where you just can't really envision things without him. He's
Right.
always going to be at the Yum Center. He's always going to be given that sly smile when they show him up on the big screen at games. And so it feels, and I know that other people have had this experience with death, whether it's personal or somebody you admired as a public figure. It felt wrong. It feels wrong to go on without him, even though this wasn't one of those deals where it was a shock and he was a 41-year-old who this came out of nowhere. It still just feels like Denny was going to be around forever. I know people used to say that about Dick Clark. He kind of was like Louisville's Dick Clark. You never really knew exactly how old he was. You just always expected to see him at the Derby, see him at games, see him around town, see him pop up in pictures with friends and all that stuff. And now that he's not, it just feels wrong. And that was kind of my initial thought in this whole thing.
Yeah, and of course you immediately think of for me from the interviews over the years, from different teams that he's had, different players he's had over the years, and obviously talking to family and friends too. That's what it always hits me, to add a personal element to it, as a way of trying to connect on an empathetic level. When your grandparent passes away and they've lived a full life and they get to the point that they're pushing 90, and I know Denny was 86. They've lived a long time. They've lived a great life. They've impacted a lot of people. I mean, Denny has impacted just about as many people in this community as anyone. I would think you could put him right up there on that list. it's a celebration of their life. And I know it's you feel for the people around Denny, who if you hear Kenny Payne talk about him, or any of those guys who played for him in the 70s and 80s, obviously his teams in the 90s too, they will talk about almost viewing him like a father figure to them. And you hear that about coaches time and again. But when you listen to how the relationships were formed, it really hits hard for you to know that that's not just a former athlete talking the way former athletes talk. That's a legitimate, heartfelt, authentic feeling about Denny Crum that they had about their coach. So from that standpoint, that hit me, knowing that it was sad. Like when my grandparents have died, I was sad for my parents. I was sad for my aunts and uncles. And so when that news hit the other day, I had a similar reaction where it's, Denny has lived this incredible life. We can celebrate Denny's life. And you feel for the people around him who revered him and adored him and loved him so much. Mike, when you think about Denny Crum, and I know you mentioned sort of that omnipresence around the program, and all the times that I talked to him, like on a game day where it'd be like, okay, yeah, I need to actually I'm going to go to dinner and then go to the game. Like still, I mean, 2 decades into the 2000s, the guy was still going to games. You mentioned the sly grin, the swagger level of Denny Crum, off the charts. I mean, his swagger could last you all the way to Pluto. What in your view, like, where did that come from? And I guess how much do you think that swagger and the way he carried himself through a time where swagger really started to kind of pop in sports, how much do you think Denny's swag helped Louisville become a program that had a swagger about it? I mean, and has for a while, and obviously it transitioned with Rick Pitino, but how much do you think his individual personality and that swagger kind of made up what the Louisville profile was when he was the coach and even past that?
It was a huge part of it. And I think that, I grew up, I always kind of felt bitter when I was really coming of age as a Louisville fan, because I missed the 80s, this dominant period where Louisville basketball makes the ascension from upper echelon program to like perennial national powerhouse. They, the team of the 80s, according to Sports Illustrated, 4 Final Fours, 2 national titles. Like I basically missed all that. I was 1 when we won the national title in 1986. And so when I started finding out about their history when I was becoming a big time fan of the 90s, I'm like, well, what the hell? Like, I think that was cool. Glad my dad and my brothers got to experience it. I didn't really get to see any of that. So the Denny that I fell in love with it in the mid to late 90s was definitely a different figure than the one that got here in the 70s and in the 80s. And that's normal. It's understandable. People change over time. He certainly had swag in the 90s and the early 2000s and then later in his life. But one of the things that was so cool about going back when I was doing the book a few years ago and looking at stories from the 1980s and from the 1970s was seeing some of the quotes where you were just like, damn, like this guy was just putting it out. Like this guy had no problem saying some stuff. Like Louisville fans love the video of him with John Teshi before the 1983 Dream Game, where they show him talking about, they have the video of Tesh interviewing Joby Hall and grilling him on like, why won't these teams play? And Joby Hall like tries to stop the interview and try to walk out. And then he relays that story to Denny Crum, and Crum is like, well, that's typical. Like, just like gives him the whole like thing. I love the quote. I found it. He was talking about, he was one of the modern guys when it came to the modern philosophy of scheduling really difficult games in November and December, not being, I mean, Louisville's 2 national title teams were not 1 seeds, and he very rarely had a 1 seed. I think 83 may have been the only one, because they would take their lumps in November and December, but he believed that it would build his teams into the best position for being successful in March. And he got asked about, I got the quote here. He got asked about this before the 1986 title game, his philosophy. And he said, I could arrange a patsy schedule, win 30 games, and be coach of the year. But as a coach, I feel secure about myself. I'm not worried about keeping my job. I'm more concerned with us being the best team we can be at the end of the year every year. If we played a patsy schedule, we wouldn't be here. I don't get paid to be coach of the year. I get paid to get Louisville as far as we can go each year, which I thought was awesome. I mean,
What a great quote.
The man is basically like, yeah, all these, that guy over there who's 30-2 and is going to win Coach of the Year. Cool. You've got a gaudy record, a glistening record. We're going to go farther than you in the NCAA tournament. He definitely had a swagger, and I do think it played a huge part in elevating Louisville to the next level. And a big part of that was him calling out Kentucky. John Clay wrote a really good thing this week saying, if Denny Crum doesn't come along in the 1970s, Louisville, Kentucky might still not be playing on an annual basis. Like they may still, or this thing could have drug on until the 90s where Kentucky just didn't want to play. Like he essentially forced Kentucky to recognize them and then start playing them on an annual basis. And if he wasn't so brash, I don't know if Louisville winning at the level that they were winning at wouldn't have been enough. Like he was willing to call out people. He was willing to, have the swagger on the sidelines. And it definitely was a huge part of why Louisville became, what they are today.
Yeah. And you mentioned that quote, and one of my all-time favorite things that I got to do when I did the oral history of the 1986 team was go back through the old Courier Journal clips from the 80s and read, like, Russ Brown is like sitting in his office and just like shooting the shit with Denny Crum, and Denny just like fires him off like right left. And the thing is like, I'm looking at some of these lines that he has, but like the thing that made Denny, I think that got him the respect that, outside of winning and obviously being an incredible tactician, a great coach, was if his team stunk, he told you they stunk.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to say it was my fault. He wasn't afraid to say what went wrong, and take responsibility for it. And there's so many examples of it, of him just kind of shooting from the hip.
Can I say it real quick?
Yeah.
One of the, before you read that quote, like one of the reasons I knew that Louisville was in trouble last year was I had a friend who went to an early practice with Denny Crum, and I won't mention the name because I'm sure they don't want me to give that away. But he said that Denny used the word sucks to describe what he was watching at practice. And I was like, well, if Denny Crum is saying it sucks, that's probably not a good sign of things to come. So Denny knew, I think Denny has high hopes, certainly for Kenny Payne moving forward. But Denny knew that this past season was probably not going to be a wild success after seeing practice and saying that it sucked.
I mean, that's incredible.
Well,
but that's swag. I mean, that's like, you don't care.
Call it like it is.
Yeah. But I'll go to this example here because it's a really funny little side story. Russ Brown. I don't think Russ Brown gets enough credit around here for writing his writing style. I know this is a very esoteric thing to be talking about, but if you're going to talk about 80s Louisville, Russ Brown is chronicling them at the big newspaper at the time.
Russ is great.
Incredible. But they're taking on, in the second round of the 86 tournament, they're playing the 7th seed the Bradley Braves. Okay, 32-2. Jim Les and Hersey Hawkins are on this team, ranked as high as 9th through the course of the season in the AP poll. Their coach, Dick Versace, was described by Russ Brown as a dapper guy with silver hair and a silver-tongued vocabulary. And then the writing is, it's a good thing Crum is meeting Versace on the court and not over a Scrabble board. But the reason I bring up that as kind of the context here is I guess Herbert Crook did not have a good game, and they ended up winning 82-68, but he didn't play well. And Denny tells the story here. I thought we beat them fairly easy on the airplane coming back. I'm sitting on the aisle up front, and Herbert Crook comes down and kneels next to me and says, "Coach, I owe you an apology." And I said, "What for?" And he said, "I've played like a dog in this tournament." I knew he hadn't played well, but I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. In the first 2 games, Crook had averaged 8 and 4, 8 points, 4 rebounds. Next 4 games, he had 16 and 10 over the final 4 games in the tournament. And according to Denny, shot about 75%. And I will never forget just hearing little anecdotes about that, about guys who felt the need to go talk to him and say, "Hey, I owe you better than what I gave you." And that was not the only example of it. But that's an open dialogue coach. That's a coach who has the respect of his guys, who know that they need to play better if they're not playing better. But they want to win for him, and they want to execute the way he wants them to execute. Because that speaks volumes for what type of coach he is, that a guy would come over and say that to him. I think. But Mike, I wanted to throw one other thing at you. Are there any what ifs for you with Denny? And I'm not trying to trivialize his legacy or anything like that. But you mentioned earlier, a little bit of resentment, being one of the younger folks growing up, knowing what the 80s had been like. Are there any what ifs that you experienced as a Louisville fan with Denny? I assume it's probably more related to the 90s teams that he had, and he had some good ones in the 90s, that you kind of still think about as far as Louisville basketball just in general?
There's one huge one that I think every Louisville fan still thinks of, and this was beaten into. I think there are like three things that were beaten into the head of every kid around my age who had dads that were growing up as big UofL fans. The first was, Houston only lost to NC State in the '83 title game because Louisville tired them out in the Final Four. Like they always
I
say
love
that. Every dad always hammered that point home. Two, yeah, two. Rodney McRae was basically like Hercules. Like he could have beaten anybody up in the entire world. Like the dads love Rodney McRae. And then three is, if Wade Houston hadn't left, if you hadn't lost Wade Houston to Tennessee and Allen Houston to Tennessee, Denny Crum would have won more national titles here. Like the 90s would have gone better. There wouldn't have been the bad years down the stretch. You wouldn't have had to have gotten forced out. I think that's the biggest what if in Denny Crum's tenure, is if he'd been able to keep Wade, if he'd been able to bring Allen to Louisville, with the good times of the 80s kept rolling on in the 90s. And I think that's the big what if. But he did seem to. Louisville started recruiting more poorly down the stretch in the 90s. You mentioned that player respect. I remember watching games where like former players would come and they'd yell at the current players because they're like, you've got a Hall of Fame coach and you're not listening to him.
That's crazy.
It definitely took on a different feel in the late 90s. Yeah. It got bad down the stretch. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, an incredible legacy. And you mentioned Wade Houston. What a guy to talk to about Denny and some of the memories in the trenches that they were in together. Good God, those guys experienced a lot at the height of college basketball for that program at the time, and got some really good players. I mean, got some really, really, really good players. And I mean, the list is just incredible of the players they brought in and coached and worked with. And I always thought it was interesting. I can't remember who said it and who they were talking about. So this is a very vague reference. But I did I wrote a story about the L's up, the history of the L's up. And I remember one player, just as an aside, was describing another teammate in the 80s. It would have been the 87 team. How they were the type of guy who needs everything explained to them. So like they need to understand why Denny Crum is asking them to do X, Y, and Z. And it was kind of like you're going to get your butt kicked if you don't figure things out quickly, my guy. But like the coaching staff worked with the player, and I can't remember who it was. So this is a really helpful anecdote, but I do think it's interesting that a good coaches, to me, and great Hall of Fame coaches, in Denny Crum's case, figure out ways to communicate and deliver their message to different ways of learning and different ways of grasping things. And I think that's something that we're learning as a society now. And you hear that now a lot more in college football, college basketball, about coaches trying to figure out different ways to get messages across to their players, and they bring in sports psychologists and all that. But I always thought that was interesting that someone could be that far ahead of the conversation, at least when it was a public thing that people were talking about, that Denny could grasp, like, hey, we need to work hard with this specific guy to make sure that he understands what's going on. I think that's pretty sweet. Well, Mike, we'll stop there. We'll take a break here. on the pod. And when we come back, we will have a chance to chat a little bit about the offseason. It's been 2 months since I did a Floyd Street's Finest. I wanted to let it breathe, as they say. I think we all needed a little bit of a break from the season, but a lot has happened in 2 months. So we'll take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Our partner for today's episode is Athletic Greens. I started taking AG1 during the college basketball season, and I love the impact that it had on my energy levels. I'm a big coffee drinker, and by the time the afternoon hit, I needed another boost. AG1 helped me tremendously, especially on the days when I didn't want to hit the gym. Their tagline is AG1 is comprehensive health and the power of habit in one, and that couldn't be more true. It's impossible to eat and drink in a healthy manner, and AG1 is exactly the supplement I need to improve my gut health, and you do too. Just mix a scoop of it with some water or add it to a smoothie, and you're ready to go. If a comprehensive solution is what you need from your supplement routine, then Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Go to athleticgreens.com/field of 68. That's athleticgreens.com/field of 68 and check it out. All right. Let's finish up our conversation here today with Mike Rutherford, transitioning to the offseason and just how things are going for Louisville basketball, because I think there's quite a few things, Mike, that warrant mentioning. I'm not going to go all the way back and rehash a whole lot from March as far as the end of season stuff. I want to throw this out there because I haven't said it. I didn't like the end of the season press conference. All right, but that was 2 months ago, so I'm not going to – no one who has listened to my podcast or me do radio stuff or write the newsletter, RIP, is going to be surprised to hear that. But I respect it at the same time. Like, I didn't love it. You got to expect that those questions were going to come, but I respect the loyalty level there of saying, like, we're not doing anything different. We need better players. Essentially, that was the argument that was made. We need a higher quality team. So what did they do? They went out and they've gotten – a lot of players, at least from a standpoint of reputation coming out of high school as high school recruits, considered to be more blue chip level players. They've gotten some nice transfers in. I guess your thoughts on the first 2 months of the offseason. And I think, Mike, I know this for a fact that you and I are very much in the camp of, this is really impressive, the kids you've gotten. And it's the expectation was that was kind of what this staff would be able to do. But I think we're all kind of in a, let's see how you coach them mode of just like, great, got some momentum for you guys, but we want to see what this looks like in the winter. But what is your takeaway so far from the first 2 months of the off season?
Well, first of all, not all of us got to take a break after the 4-28 season. You're like, oh, we all needed some time to breathe. Some of us didn't have that option.
I know.
We've been in the trenches dealing with the KP's the greatest coach of all time versus KP's the worst thing that's ever happened every damn day for the last 2 months, and showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon. But as far as what's happened in the 2 months with the roster, like you said, I think you expected the staff to provide an uptick in talent. They've done that. You can't knock a top 5 recruiting class, which is what they've been able to produce in 2023, which is, they still had that NCAA cloud hovering over them for part of that cycle. So to be able to land some of the guys that became available at the 11th hour, to be able to keep a guy like Caleb Glenn, to be able to get Trenton Flowers and get him reclassed into 2023 is no small feat. And they certainly deserve applause for that. I think what has some fans concerned about the upcoming season is a lot of the questions that are being asked on May 15th, 2023 are the same questions that were being asked on May 15th, 2022. A lot of the issues with the roster seem to be the same. One, it's extremely young. And youth has not thrived in college basketball recently. The teams that are winning national titles, the teams that are going deep in the NCAA tournament, for the most part, are teams that are led by juniors and seniors, occasionally a sophomore tossed in, but freshmen aren't winning at a very high level right now in college hoops. The most glaring hole on the roster seems to be the same as it was a year ago, where you've only got one really true lead guard at least in terms of like traditional sense. And a lot of guys out there who it seems like, you're kind of calling guard, but can they really handle the ball? Can they initiate the offense? Can they, take some of the ball handling duties off of Sky Clark? Are they going to be able to step up and run the show when Clark is in foul trouble? Or if he's, God forbid, hurt for a game or two.
Mhm.
And also, like, how good is Sky Clark? I think I personally think that Sky Clark is going to have a good year. We've seen him play 13 games at Illinois, and he was very up and down, had as many turnovers as assists, showed flashes of brilliance, showed flashes of being a true freshman running the show at a power conference program and looking like he wasn't quite ready for that. Also still is a guy who's coming off of a significant injury that ended his high school career early. So I just feel like with this roster, there's a whole lot of like, if kind of like last year, and not a lot of like, I know this, I know that. And it's why whenever I hear anybody talking absolutes about what this season's going to bring, whether it's we're absolutely going to suck or we're absolutely going to be great, I can't believe anybody. How do you know? Nobody has ever seen Karan Davis play against quality competition. We didn't know who that kid was before he announced that he was going to. You have no idea how good Karan Davis is. People are like,
true.
You're undervaluing Karan Davis. He's a dog. He's going to be a great point guard. People are like, Karan Davis sucks. He's never going to see the court. We've got no idea how good he is. We've got no clue how good he is. We don't, and even things that we think we know, we don't know how much of a step forward a guy like Mike James is going to take, or a guy like Brandon Huntley Hatfield is going to take. Like, we can guess that they're going to be better than they were a year ago, but you never know for certain. We all thought Sidney Curry was going to take a step forward last year, and he took 5 steps back, it felt like. So there's just so much that we don't. I mean, Trenton Flowers, typically kids who reclass as true freshmen don't have as much of an impact as maybe their recruiting ranking would indicate. Like, maybe he's the opposite. Maybe he's a kid who's going to be an 18-year-old who just stars from day one, or maybe it's going to take some time and he's going to have to adjust and kind of have more of a Kamari Lands type freshman season. We don't have the answers to any of these questions. And I think it's why the portion of the fan base that is maybe a little bit cautiously pessimistic or extremely pessimistic is feeling that way, because we kind of had some of those same doubts a year ago. And the result was not just a bad season, but a 4-28 season that was the worst of anybody who's a Louisville fan right now, their lifetimes. Yeah. So if you're going to make the jump from the worst of the worst to like NCAA tournament good, which I think should be the standard for a Louisville coach in year 2 in this day and age, like, do you really see that happening with just the uptick in young talent? And I think that's where people are like, we've got to get some transfers that are juniors and seniors. We got to get some transfer guards. And now it's a little bit late for that. You got one scholarship available. And I think that's the never ending argument that has been happening this offseason so far, is that one.
Yeah. Well, and the repetitive nature of the conversation makes it harder to really do much with it. I mean, you're just like, all of those points make sense. You need more ball handlers. Last year was a was a very obvious, and I know for Louisville fans, a very painful lesson in that, is that you're not going to survive with one, even if that one is scoring at the rate that LLS was scoring and doing the things that he was doing. And it's just not feasible. And by the time you get to where we are now in May, the options are not what they were 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago. And I think that makes it a massive, massive question mark. Now, what I will say is, and you mentioned Trenton Flowers. I think that Louisville landing Trenton Flowers is probably the most important out of all of these kids they've brought in. And the reason I say that, and I shouldn't say kids, these guys they're bringing in, is when Kenny Payne was hired, the entire argument was he's going to go out and get kids exactly like Trenton Flowers. Mm-hmm. And they put in the time on him for the last, for however many months it was. They put in the time on him. They went on a bunch of visits to see him. They did everything that would show that it was significant interest. They worked, then they got the commitment. Now, you toss in the reclassification that maybe complicates things a little bit for what the expectations are, like you said, Mike. And we've seen that so many times before with these reclassification recruitments, where it's like, the two kids. It always comes back to these two kids for me, and I know people probably get annoyed because that was now like 7 or 8 years ago. But Maverick Rowan,
Yeah.
and the other guard. Who ended up also at NC State. Refresh my memory. The Johnson kid from Ohio. Do you remember who I'm talking about?
No, I don't. Johnson from Ohio. I
It might
don't
not have
remember.
been Johnson. There's a point guard from Ohio. I think it was
Not.
from Cleveland.
Oh, no, I'm not.
This is going to bother me while we're in the middle of the
Okay.
podcast.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget. Why don't you look it up? Why don't you look up
Okay.
NC State from like 2017 or 2018? It would have been while Patino was still coaching. And you pin a lot of hopes on a reclassifying kid. And that happens a lot in recruiting, where it's like, this kid is awesome in this class. Let's move him up a class and get him into college now. And yeah, sometimes those kids are a little bit older, or obviously in this case, they're able to get their schoolwork done in time so that they can get out of high school sooner. That shows a level of maturity, I think. But you're still asking for a lot from him. Now, the good news is you've got a variety of bodies and players who can play a similar position as that kind of 6-7 wing that Louisville has 12 of those guys on their roster.
Mm-hmm.
But that guy, that recruitment to me, and getting that guy and getting Trenton Flowers, I think was the most important recruiting win for this staff of any of those guys, because I think it showed that they could be in something competitive for a long time and win it. But now, like you said, I mean, it's a matter of whether or not he actually produces, if it goes well, if he fits, et cetera, et cetera. You got an answer for me?
Were you thinking of Braxton Beverly?
No.
Not Dennis Evans, right?
No.
Yeah,
No.
Yeah, I couldn't find. You'll have to look at it, but I like it. I think that you're probably right. I think that it's in terms of like, I guess, showing that you can do what the fan base expected you to do when you got the job.
Exactly.
The problem with that is, it might be later than you think if you're Kenny Payne and you're talking about trying to land big name recruits and then develop them over 2 or 3 years. Because if this
Markell Johnson
was a beast. He was great.
Yeah,
I don't remember him being a big reclass. I don't know.
There was like a whole conversation that he might reclassify. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
You're good. I think that if you're Kenny Payne right now, you have to know, and a lot of people think that he's not recruiting this way, but if you have another season like the one that you just had, or one that's even, slightly better, you're probably not going to get a year 3. I don't know what the threshold is for Josh Hurd. I don't know where his head is. But if I would assume if you go like 8-56 over 2 years at a place like Louisville, you're not going to get a 3rd year. Mm-hmm. So it's great to get a kid like that, but if he can't produce as a true freshman, he's not going to really help you save your job. He may help you hopefully win a national title when you've got things rolling 2 or 3 years down the line, but you got to get to that point first. But it was a nice reassurance, because when you look at his big recruiting wins coming to Louisville so far, he kept Kamari Lands. He kept Caleb Glenn. He got Curtis Williams, who I think can be a good college player. Dennis Evans was a weird recruitment because he became available out of nowhere at like the 11th hour. But Flowers is the one guy that, like you said, traditional recruitment, 5-star, high 4-star kid. You're in on him. You take the visits. You get him on campus. It feels like that's a win over big time programs. Mm-hmm. Whereas Louisville fans, I think we're starting to look at, hey, we recruited DJ Wagner pretty hard, didn't get him. We recruited Aaron Bradshaw pretty hard, didn't get him. I know this happened after the Flowers recruitment, but Carter Bryant, you're in on him. He's coming to town. He's doing all this stuff. Big time 5-star kid, goes to Arizona. Like, we need to win some of these battles. Flowers is the one that you point at and say, we won that one. Mm-hmm. I think in the transfer portal, you wish that we'd seen a little bit more of that. Trey White, I do think, is a guy that is going to help them next season. But like you said, he's another 6'7" guy that I think has a skill set that maybe does not alleviate some of the duties that are going to be on Sky Clark's shoulders. We'll see. I mean, who knows? Again, like, maybe he got insanely better the last few months handling the ball and becoming a more less turnover prone guard. We just don't know any of these things. But the fact that we're asking these questions, I think, has a lot of Louisville fans on edge. But if Payne is going to, see this thing through, if he is going to be the guy, I think it has to be a combination of either you win big this year, you make the NCAA tournament, no brainer, cool, let's go, we got our guy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in that sort of purgatory area where, let's say, he wins 14, 15, 16, 17 games, one of the things that he needs to have in his corner is, I've got a huge 24 class lined up. Like, I'm killing it on the recruiting trail. I'm going to bring in top tier talent year after year. We're going to bring some of these guys that had success this year, a little bit of success. They're going to come back. We're going to be even better. Like, he's got to check those boxes. If this isn't going to be like a 24, 25 win team, which I think even the most staunch Kenny Payne supporters probably think that it's going to take a lot to get to that point. So, he's got to keep killing on the recruiting trail. And then obviously we're going to have to see some big increase in results on the floor.
One last thing I'll leave people with, and this is something that logically, it makes a ton of sense, and it's just something that I think the rest of us don't always think about. To your point of if you're building towards something, it's for us, especially in a market like Louisville, with college basketball being what it is in this area, every day we talk about the target, right? Every day you say, okay, the minimum standard for Louisville basketball is the NCAA tournament. They should be there every year, whether they're an 8-9 game or a 7-10 game, or they're one of the best teams in the country. The 7-10, 8-9 teams are off years for Louisville, and they're just, they go in 20-10. That's the expectation of this basketball program. And it's hard to separate that from the day-to-day that the coaching staff has going on and the players have going on. And I think that's a really interesting perspective. And full disclosure, I heard this from one of our players at Racing Louisville, where it's like, people are saying, hey, this team should make the playoffs this year. And they're like, well, we've got breakfast at 8:30 and we've got film at 9. And we, it's a very different mindset. And I'm really intrigued to see, and this is just from a sit back and observe standpoint, I'm really intrigued to see how this team gets to work at the end of the month and starts trying to mold these players. And then, like you said, if they do have that one last scholarship out there that they can find, maybe a veteran guard to come in and have an impact. Even if it's a Jared West type, where it's, I know we now use him as like the new reference, even though that team was not very good at all. But the veteran influence that he had coming in, knowing he might not, when they recruited him, it was not you're going to play 35 minutes a game. It was you're going to be a guy coming off the bench for us, play 15 minutes, but you're a huge presence in the locker room and you can be part of something special. Obviously that did not go that way. But if there's even a guy like that out there, that's a huge plus for Louisville to find. But I'm fascinated to see how they approach the day-to-day and how they feel like they're getting better incrementally as they go. Because for them, it's a lot easier to focus on that than to worry about the big picture. Are you playing for your coach's job? All of those things, NCAA tournament, all of those expectations. So we'll see how it plays out, Mike. But thank you for your time today. And I'm glad we could do this. And I'm glad that we got a chance to celebrate Denny a little bit more. What a legend, what an absolute legend. And I hope that everyone gets the chance to celebrate his life and think a little bit more about the impact that he's had. I know some people get a little weird when it comes to like sports figures, but I think some of them transcend sports, and Denny Crum certainly is in that category in Louisville as a guy who has transcended just basketball. He is just a huge figure here in this community, in this area, and a great chance to celebrate a wonderful life. So there you go. Thank you, Mike.
Of course, man. Yeah, real quickly, think about the fact that like every fan base, every level, pro sports, whatever, college sports, when you hire a new coach, you have this just unrealistic vision in your head of like, this guy's going to come here, take us to the next level, and then he's going to fall in love with us so much and the city so much that he's just never going to leave. Yeah. And like 99%
That's
of the
Denny.
time, it's not true for us. Like that was Denny, and he was one of us. He lived as a fan for the last 22 years, like going to games. It was just like that's why I think that's part of the reason why he's going to be so missed here forever. Was not only was he the coach that took this program to the next level, he was one of us. We knew that he cared about this program every bit as much as we do. And a lot of times, even when you have successful coaches, that's not the case. He's definitely going to be missed.
Great note to end on. Thank you, Mike. We'll see everybody soon.